Okay, here we go.
Hmm.
Good day, everyone. Welcome
Let me
back
just
to Am I
confirm
Streaming
recording.
or Am I Dreaming? We are live, and today I'm joined by TayeedSA. He does retro gaming and also automotive content. And we've got a very exciting conversation in store. We're going to be talking about the PlayStation 1,
Hmm.
the first iteration of the Sony PlayStation. Now, it's a very interesting topic, and we're really going to go in depth and speak about how the experiences with this console. So, my first question for you is: now in the year
Hmm.
2021, what influenced you to go back to the PS1?
Well, looking back and also seeing things currently, yeah, the PlayStation 5 is out, and it's kind of hard to try and get that console at this point, considering that there's almost no stock anyway. And let's also not forget the price tag as well, in that, look, if you're going to be getting it retail, you're going to be paying around 13,000 Rand, which is not cheap by any stretch of the word. And ultimately, I also decided that, games are also pretty pricey at the moment now as well. It's a bit of an ask to pay at least 1,300 Rand for a game. And while if it's a game that I'm really excited for, I will drop the money for it day one if possible. But at the same time, also, I've been looking back at a lot of the older games that I used to see as a kid. You used to have shows in South Africa called Cybernet, and you'd see that stuff on SABC, DSTV, whatever you may have at that point, and even little discussions would come up on the shows that, hey, this game is out. Have you seen this? And you hear your friends talk about it at school, and you hear it on the playground, like, hey, you played this game, like, yo, this was on this console, and you're just like, oh, this is interesting. You'd see it in the magazines, even like, a lot of you may remember Otaku magazine or even Nag magazine to some extent, which used to be around for a while. Then, print media is slowly kind of taking a different turn at this point. So I went back to the retro kind of games, not only because it's a little bit cheaper, depending on the instance, of course, because some games which are rare and very timeless tend to get quite pricey. You end up even paying the same price as a brand new game nowadays, depending on condition, if you can find it and everything in between. And it's also a nice way to dabble into import export culture, seeing different regions and what they offered. And just games also from how I also see it, you know, fine, they may be older, some may have dated, some may have not aged as well as others, but you can't argue that at the end of the day, this is art. In many sense of the words, it can be game design, it can be aesthetic, music especially, because music was really around about the time when, especially with this era of stronger consoles coming about. I mean, even with the older consoles as well, you could say that as well. You could dabble a bit more because of the power involved, and a lot of timeless soundtracks also have been come about from that era as well. PlayStation One going onwards, even on top of that. So it was fun to get back into, and also to figure out that, a lot of the things don't work on modern TV, so you have to figure out a way to make them work. And even just graphical design and just choices, especially it was the time where you got a lot of experimentation as well. And that's really what I liked getting out of it, to put it like that.
Okay, okay. So we've got quite a bit to unpack this episode. So one point that I like that you mentioned is you mentioned the art. When did you first
Hmm.
interact with a PlayStation 1, and when did you realize that this particular machine contained a high level of art?
So it comes with a little bit of a story when, yeah, I'm the youngest out of my three brothers. And the thing is, we got our PlayStation from, look, I was really young, so my memory's a bit spotty. It was either Westgate or Sam Levy's village in Harare, Zimbabwe. If you know that place, then hey, we're Sam Levy's village and Westgate people. Very nice places back in those days. And yeah, it was difficult to get games at that time. And, the PlayStation 1, it came with a demo disc. Anyone who's had a PlayStation knows that, demo discs were like, well, that was a thing where you could experiment and see different kinds of games, features, and all those things. So one of the games that I remember specifically was Rage Racer made by Namco. We're speaking about art, aesthetic, and music, and intertwining all of that together to make a memorable experience. So what Rage Racer basically was, it was an arcade racer, and arcade racer basically meaning that yeah, cool, it's a fun racer, all cool, and you'd see this in an arcade maybe if you jumped in and got into that whole scene. And while I started paying attention to things like graphic design, sound effects, and you start thinking that, oh, what did they actually do to draw this? How did they actually stylize this? Because also the other thing about Rage Racer as well, especially
Mm.
that Namco series of games, is that it's not. It doesn't really take so much from real life in terms of real card brands and everything between. Namco
Okay.
designed everything themselves. They got references and influences, yes, definitely,
Mm.
but at the same time, it was, how can I put this? They basically had creative freedom to do what they wanted in that sense. And a lot of the music was very catchy
Mm.
and just overall aesthetic, overall views, environment design, everything that you see in games like that. That triggered something in me and like, how did they do this? Why is this like this? This looks interesting. How can I make more of this? And that was also more elaborated more when one of my brothers borrowed a copy of Ridge Racer Type 4 from a mate at school, brought it home, and then that stuck with me ever since. I even still have a copy of that game up to today and like to revisit it from time to time, just also for artistic inspiration, and the music slaps. I recommend that you go and listen to the soundtrack. Beautiful, beautiful soundtrack. If you love jazz, funky, stuff, good singing, all of that. So that's kind of where it also started for me, and I feel that's also what makes it memorable for a lot of people. It's all those little things like the music, aesthetic, and art intertwined that whenever someone hears PlayStation 1, they think, oh, that era. That's, when they really
Mm.
dabbled in X, Y, and Z, in my opinion, at least.
Okay, okay. So this is a very powerful memory for you. Let's really unpack it and really go into it. So
Mm,
you mentioned first getting the console. How was the build up that week when you heard?
mm,
So I believe the time frame was about the year 1996.
mm.
And you said it was Ridge Racer. Was it which version was it?
It was Raid Racer. So Raid Racer, if I recall this correctly, it was the second iteration on the PlayStation 1. The first one was Ridge Racer Revolution, which was basically the arcade Ridge Racer, but
Okay.
they opted for the PlayStation 1 in the sense that they added more features, more tracks,
Hmm.
more content, so to speak. So you could flesh out more as a PlayStation game as opposed to, let's say, a 5 minute arcade experience in a
Okay.
sense. So it was also around about those times when I'd say even before the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, the SNES, or SNES as
Okay.
people like to call it, when arcades were transitioning more into home consoles, at least from the way that I was seeing it. It started
Okay.
a while back, but you could see more of it also just coming in as well because the PlayStation was a smash hit. Everybody knows that. That's, common
Hmm.
knowledge. So when I saw a lot of games, especially Japanese gaming, because that's what I also followed a lot of, you could
Hmm.
see that a lot of it was getting or transitioning from that arcade setting more to the home console. So and the thing is with the arcade stuff in particular, from what I've noticed, it really needs to it well not really needs it attracts attention to itself because
Hmm.
when you sit down and you think about it, you go to an arcade and you want people to come to your cabinet, you're going to have to use things in such a way, or just those elements of art that I mentioned,
Hmm.
to attract people to your cabinet. To be like, I even remember a Dance Dance Revolution cabinet that used to, exclaim across the speakers, "Come here and play!" And people wondered, like, "Oh, what's that? Let's go take a look at that." So
Hmm.
it lends itself to that, but then also it's different with consoles in a sense for the way that I see it, but it's also around about that transition and also something that also reflected with a lot of games that I saw as well. So that's how I see it basically.
Okay. So the way you've described it is it was like having an arcade machine, loud, colorful. It calls you in, having an arcade machine in
Mm,
your home. Is that what it felt like?
mm.
Okay.
It kind of felt like that in a sense, physically, not in the same because you can't really have a big cabinet and, loudspeakers and all that. You probably get smacked if you turn that on at night and made noise for the whole family. But, it was something that could be realized in the home. Let me put it like that.
Okay. When do you think was the first time you saw a PlayStation?
The first time I saw a PlayStation, from what I recall in memory, was the time when we got one as a house. That was pretty much my first time. From what I can
Okay.
remember, I was really young back in those days,
Okay.
so a lot of the memory is a bit spotty. But when you look at the design of the PlayStation itself, the design is timeless. You'll remember it, straight away, in a sense. But as far back as my memory goes, it was around about that time in 1996. Let me say, I think,
Okay.
when us as a house got a first one. Let me say it like that.
Okay. Okay. I can add a bit of information to the story. So that time in 1996, the first time we saw a PlayStation was we had visited two different people's houses, and they had a PlayStation. And when we played their PlayStation, it was the first time we had seen a gaming console of that level of power. So we had had a SNES before. It was the family entertainment system. It was an off-brand SNES, and we had interacted with those type of games. Then we interacted with the
Yeah.
Super Nintendo system. We had a cousin who had Donkey Kong,
Mm,
and then we
mm,
saw more graphical power. So we were used to 8-bit images. Then we saw
mm,
16-bit images. Then we encountered
mm,
people who
mm,
had
mm,
32-bit images. And it was the first time to see a game played on CD-ROM at disk. So we went to their house and they had three different games. One of them was Doom, and it even had an age restriction rating. And they had a demo disc. That was also the age of demo
Doom.
discs. And one of the first times we had ever
That's a
interacted with
while
that
ago.
game
Jeez.
was he had a demo disc, and sometimes you could even get demo discs from magazines, and we
Mm.
put it in, and it had you could try like
Ah,
eight
yes. Ah,
different
yes.
games,
That.
and on there
Mm.
was Platinum Games, Tekken. I think they had Tekken 2 at that time, and so
Yeah. Yeah. I think it was
those
Tekken
kids
2.
had it. Then
Yeah.
we had an older cousin who was living in Johannesburg who had a PlayStation. And when it got round, our mother really saw how much we were talking about this thing. We saw a PlayStation. Then we called her, come see this, come see this machine. This machine is an entertainment
Mm,
system. And the effect it had on children, and when guests
mm,
came,
mm,
it was almost like a piece of artwork in your house, like having a vase. It was almost a status symbol to
mm,
say, "Hey, I've got a PlayStation.
mm,
He's got a PlayStation." And we they even had the soccer game FIFA, and there was the multi-tap controller, and multiple kids could play. And it was not. I can't.
mm,
My interaction when we first saw it, it wasn't like seeing a machine. It was like going into another world. That machine was an entry point into just
mm,
another
mm,
world.
mm,
And um,
mm,
I can tell you now, one of the first times first saw a PlayStation was we saw other people who had it. And when we played their machine, it was on our minds. We have to have something like this. Then the other big thing is Sony's
mm,
advertising campaign at that time was lethal. Lethal, lethal. They advertised that machine like it
mm,
was a movie. They had expo shows,
mm,
toy stores, Toys R Us. Everywhere you went, they would have a big marketing
mm.
stand. Sony PlayStation. Now, do you remember the first time you saw that machine switched on? Could you describe what it felt like to switch on that machine?
Just coming back to what you were saying also. So, yeah, that actually pretty much was more concise.
Mm.
Rec-
Uh-oh. Looks like it's frozen.
what we also had. But
Sorry,
then, yeah,
please,
the thing
please
about the
could you
friends' houses and
repeat could you repeat that? It completely froze.
oh, I don't know what happened. No, just coming back to what you were saying, the recollection of events. Yeah, I was really young at the time, hence
Okay.
why I remembered more of when we had our own PlayStation. And yes, 100% on the thing of yes, we had a cousin that
Mm.
had the PlayStation and
Mm.
also going to friends' houses and all of that.
Mm.
And yeah, we had the experience of, I'd say, in terms of consoles in general, yes, the Famicom system or NES, depending on where you are in the world,
Mm.
we had the off-brand version. Anyone in the Southern African region would know Golden China because
Mm,
that was the off-brand NES
mm,
system that you got. 1,000 games in one.
mm,
Maybe only 700 of those games worked,
mm,
whichever worked
mm.
cartridge you got. So yeah. But coming back to your question, how it felt like starting that system for the same time. The startup sound for the PlayStation, and many people have said it, it's a powerful sound in that it catches your attention with I'm not really good at music so I can't explain this very well, but kind of like just a bass or synth bass
Mm.
in a sense that is impacting, and it has punch, and that captures your attention. And of course, you then deal with the chimes and everything and shows that, hey,
Mm.
Sony Computer Entertainment System, this is what we made. So that left an impression to be like, what is this epic system? I
Yeah.
thought to myself. And hearing that startup sound, you as you've mentioned that you're going into a whole other world.
Mm.
So that essentially was like an entry into that in a sense, or the start of getting into something, and showing that logo to say this is a PlayStation game system, and then going on forward just to show that, oh, this is the developer. Here's your game. Let's begin. So definitely needs an impression, 100%. From the tactile pressing of the button, the click
There you
clack,
go.
we're turning it on,
Yeah.
and then it starts with that sound. So that's the brilliance of it, I say.
Do you still feel the impact of that console to this day?
To this day, yes, there still is an impact. Sony has tried to recreate that sort of impact in a sense by bringing back older games, remastering them, and to some extent, and I know it's a little bit forbidden in the PlayStation community, but the Sony PlayStation Classic, which was a bit of a dismal mini console that was trying to, at least in my opinion, trying to cash in on the hype surrounding what Nintendo did with their SNES Classic, which I say was a success, and it did the whole remaster thing brilliantly, in my opinion, for the modern age. Because here's the thing, also, like what I mentioned, it's a bit, and the fact that everything is pretty much HDMI. That's what it is at this point. AV cables are a bit, I don't want to say archaic, but in technology terms, you could say that it's that.
Hmm.
So bringing that back, and also, oh,
Uh-oh. I'm seeing it seems to be freezing. Uh-oh. Oh, sorry, you
uh,
disconnected for a minute.
yeah, I saw it
I'll just
disconnected.
move on to the next question. So, we've covered
Mm,
how you first interacted this machine and
mm,
just how there were so many design elements that really differentiated it from other machines. As you mentioned, the
mm,
big round disk tray and two big round buttons, power
mm,
on, disk tray open. And when you really pushed it down, they could have
mm,
made a small button if they wanted to. They were very, very intentional about it. Its shape, it was something that was on your
mm,
mind. And even the games as well, that was something they really even showed in the
mm,
adverts. Hop into the world of PlayStation, the Sony world. Now,
mm.
you mentioned
Play in our
Namco.
world. Yeah, that
Yeah.
was one of the big quotes.
Mm,
Yeah.
mm. You mentioned Namco. Now, Namco is a design house
Mm,
in Japan. They work on the software. Okay, so they work on the software.
mm.
Namco is a big time game franchise. What other big time game franchises left an impact on you? Even if you don't know the name of the company, but even the name of a particular title, which you felt you jumped into a world. You weren't just playing a game. Did you ever have that experience with a PlayStation?
Mm. There's, let me say, there are quite a few,
Okay.
and I'll also just try and keep this short.
No, no, don't keep it
Crash
short at all. Like this is
Bandicoot,
long
Naughty
format
Dog.
content. Go tell it all.
Okay. Okay. if we're looking on the adventure side, Crash Bandicoot fried Naughty Dog,
Okay, okay.
Spyro
So
from
tell us,
Insomniac
what
Games.
for someone who's never played Crash Bandicoot, it's 2021. For someone who's never played Crash Bandicoot, what was it to you? How did you encounter it? What was it?
Okay, it was completely different to Super Mario in a sense because Super Mario was pretty much the first adventure platformer that I played as a kid, and basically at the time it was Nintendo versus Sega when Super Mario was around, and then of course Sonic the Hedgehog came around in the 90s, and then of course PlayStation also needed their own mascots, to put it simply. And many know this, that Crash Bandicoot was essentially, and as the name is colloquially known as, Sonic's ass, which is what it is. So forward going instead of just side scrolling, and you break boxes, you jump around, you break things, you collect stuff, and you do it to catchy music and to colorful, beautiful graphics. That was what the PlayStation 1 was also good at. Of course, 3D rendering. You needed a console at that time that wanted to pioneer in 3D rendering. The PlayStation, at least, was one of those consoles that did it at the time. So a lot of interesting games came about as a result, and especially with this 3D action platforming adventure like Crash Bandicoots and Spyro's the Dragon, and a few others also to boot as well,
Okay,
because a
what
lot
is
of
Spyro the Dragon?
PC games also at the
If I've
time
never seen
also came
Spyro the
out.
Dragon, could you describe what it was?
That adventure book that you probably saw at a library in your primary school, basically that, but it has voice acting and you actually interact. That's Spyro the Dragon. It's basically fairy tale land,
Okay.
but it's fun and it's interesting and it actually has some really nice quirky humor. That's what it is basically. But I think the biggest for me that also influenced more of my interest into automotive vehicles was the Gran Turismo series. That was one of
Mm,
them hands down. Because
mm,
Gran Turismo, what it was to a lot of people at the time, like it wasn't the first driving simulator. It's a driving game, racing driving game. To put it out there for those who don't know, like it wasn't the first game to do driving simulation, but it was one of the ones that really pushed it forward. Is
okay.
how I'd put it, and it became so popular and so interesting. And what the biggest thing also that Gran Turismo did was, and not only for me but to a lot of people as well, it introduced more people to Japanese motoring. And I
Mm,
thoroughly love Japanese motoring and also the culture surrounding it, because that's what also Gran Turismo introduced into it. Because a lot of the other games that came out at the time, in terms of racing, like Need for Speed, High Stakes, to name a few, there were a lot of Western European cars, European American type of cars, which was cool. I liked it a lot also. But Gran Turismo, I felt in terms of aesthetic design and just the overall content, it interested me a lot more in a sense. So that was really one of the games or franchises, let me say, that also influenced more of my interest in automotive vehicles and even to an extent photography and videography as well when you look at it.
okay.
So those are just to name a few. If I could pick the big three, those would be those few. There's many others that I could potentially look up, but just off the top of my head, that's what I
Okay.
would pick.
Okay, so just to recap what you've said, the three big franchise titles that really left an impact for you were Crash Bandicoot. Now, this was a platformer, a 3D platformer where you ran facing forward. You had this
Mm,
little red Tasmanian devil like character who wore shorts and Converse All Stars, and he ran forward and he could do little spin attacks,
mm,
and it had story to
mm,
it. He collected crystals, he collected wampa fruit. They said it was apples, and he had to
mm.
dodge TNT and nitro. Then Spyro
Yeah,
the
yeah.
dragon, where you played almost like a baby dragon with a big head. He could glide and he could jump, and puzzle solving
Hmm.
and music, fairy music, and Gran
Mm,
Turismo. Real driving simulator was
mm,
its tagline. Jazz soundtrack.
mm.
And how did Gran Turismo differ from other driving games? Why did Gran Turismo leave an impact for you versus a Ridge Racer or something like that?
Gran Turismo, as you've mentioned, it's The soundtrack, especially, that was one thing, because the copy of Gran Turismo 2 that we had, that was my first exposure to the series, thanks to one of my cousins who gave us the game, literally. It was actually in all Japanese because it was, what you call it? I don't want to say bootleg, it was a copy. That's what it was. That's what you could get at the time living in Southern Africa. It was difficult to get original games. Some were there in South Africa, but they were expensive, and it was also around about the time where people wanted to get more into the gaming aspect, but it was a little bit expensive to do so. But that's a story for another day. But Gran Turismo, as I've mentioned, it introduced a lot of people to Japanese motoring, which a lot of other games that, from what I know from the time, didn't really introduce. Like Need for Speed focused more on what was in America and Europe at the time, American and Euro vehicles,
Okay,
which was really
just
nice,
to
very
add,
interesting.
who was
But
the
there
production
wasn't
house
so
that
much.
made Need for Speed? Just to add some more context, who was the production house that made Need for
Just to
Speed?
add, yeah. So production house was Electronic Arts.
There we go. And they
From what I
are
from what I know, yeah, it should be
Western.
Electronic Arts.
So they are Western.
It's a Western studio.
Okay.
Yes.
Gran Turismo are
Mhm.
Japanese.
Japanese.
Western aesthetic,
Hmm.
Japanese aesthetic. Right?
Hmm.
Those were the two
Hmm.
big driving forces behind a lot of major franchise titles. Right?
Mm.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true.
Okay. Just to confirm that. So when to go back to originally what you discussed, the PlayStation was art.
Mm.
A big driving force
Mm.
behind that art, Western, American, and European, and Japanese
Mm.
art.
Mm.
Okay. Okay. So just to summarize everything we've discussed now, we've gone in detail to talk about the two big driving forces, this world that we jumped into with the PlayStation 1, Western and Japanese
Mm.
art forms.
Yeah, exactly
Okay.
that.
Okay.
So completely different aesthetics between the two. Well, let me not say only aesthetics, but also storytelling, depending on which kind of game you're dealing with, and vibes as well. Because, of course, you're dealing with two different parts of the world that have different cultures, different customs, and everything in between. And one of the other games that was also around as well, and that really left an impact on people, was Final Fantasy VII, myself
Mm.
included.
Where
And
where where is Final
yeah, I was
Fantasy
quite
from?
young at the
For someone
time.
who's never played it, where is it from?
Final Fantasy, the franchise, is from Square Enix, or at the time, Square Soft, and that is from Japan. So you're
Okay.
looking at the East.
Japanese and Western art aesthetics. As somebody who you've mentioned titles from Western and Japanese, what are some of the differences in their design aesthetic and gameplay that you noticed? Because you mentioned you liked both titles, but they're from completely different places. What were some of the differences between those game aesthetics as someone who played both American and also Japanese games?
Mm. In terms of American and Japanese games, I feel with a lot of the Japanese games that also came out at the time, especially considering how what Japan was also doing at that point. I might be incorrect in some instances, so please correct me where I'm wrong. Is a lot of the time I noticed there was a lot of a jazz aesthetic, or let me not say aesthetic, but jazz music involved in some of the games. Especially that's true about Gran Turismo. I noticed, with the soundtrack, but then also the type of storytelling, because you see storytelling in Japanese culture, I'd say, is way different to Western storytelling. The exact words to pin it down, it's on the tip of my tongue, but I can't
Hmm.
say I can't really figure out the word at
Okay.
this point.
Okay, so not a
But
big
I've noticed with
stress,
a lot more of the
but
Western stuff, it's
so
more.
sorry to interrupt. Um, a big focus is not so
Mm,
much on the words, but a lot on the feelings and your
mm,
experiences on
mm,
it. So maybe for me,
mm,
just to elaborate my question more, what was in your experience
mm,
something that you felt was a big difference between playing an American, and we can also say European, American and European game, Western, and maybe okay, we'll even put the big three franchise houses based on where they were from. We also played games from ADOS Entertainment. Tomb Raider was
Mm,
by ADOS.
mm.
That was European. UK, I
Yeah.
believe. Okay. Also,
Hmm.
very different design, aesthetic, and gameplay
Yeah.
for a Japanese game. Within the
Mm,
family of Japanese games, not all of them were the same, but within that family, there were certain traits that were within this pool, certain
mm.
traits in this pool. What were some of the things you felt and noticed playing an American game versus a European game versus a Japanese game? Any small things you may have noticed? I'll name a few after, but little things you noticed, right?
Mm,
Like this is even just from
mm.
looking, holding it in your hands, the disc, or even just the booklet, the package. What were a few things you noticed?
Uh, I'd say for European and Japanese games, they were a little bit more reserved in how they delivered their content, whereas the American stuff, it was kind of more in your face, in a sense. Really like out there to say, this is our game. Whereas the European and the Japanese stuff, I've seen that it's a bit more, how can I put this? What's the word I'm looking for? What is the word I'm looking for? It's more, I'd say, smooth. Let me put it like that,
Mm,
in a sense. Not to say that American games are rough or anything in that sense of the word.
mm,
It's just more how it presented itself, even with its advertising and everything in between.
mm,
So that's how I would put it.
mm.
It was they were definitely out there. Let me put them like that.
Okay, okay. We could even break it up even more. Like some games you've really felt came from like a triple A gaming house and they were almost like a blockbuster movie. Others were from smaller gaming houses,
Mm,
but the concepts were fun
mm,
to play. So, what in
mm.
some of or let me rephrase my question again. What were some of the highlights of playing an American game versus the highlights of playing a Japanese game versus the highlights of playing a European game? What were some highlights you felt like, wow, this is something they really dialed in well?
I'd say gameplay features in terms of how smooth games can play. I mean, across board, all of them I felt played very well, but it was more the aesthetic behind the games as well as the music.
Mm,
Like all of it's hard to say also because a lot of them were on equal footing.
mm,
So from what I, of course, what I can remember and what I can pick up, and really what they also ultimately just tried to do was to test the limits of the console. Like, what can we actually do with this, in a sense? So I think that's where it ultimately boils down to is who actually pushed the most, in a sense. And I'd say all of them were pretty much on equal footing because from all regions, all the games that came out, especially the memorable ones at least, they always brought something different to the table, but everything that was brought to the table was good. So for me to pick one, it's hard to say for me personally.
or not
You
to
know,
pick one
from
specifically,
if that
but just
answers
to
the
mention
question.
specific highlights where there was one gay like a big thing for me with the PlayStation 1 was it was a learning experience. I learned things from playing it that I felt I couldn't have learned anywhere else.
Mm,
So to share some of my highlights from playing with that
mm,
console, just in terms of the music, a big
mm,
highlight for me for playing Japanese games was
mm,
sometimes the composition of the music was so iconic and matched the scene so well that way later, years after
mm,
playing some of these games, and when I have that feeling uh, for the day, I actually go on YouTube
mm,
and I type in a particular name or scene from a particular, and it's usually Japanese
mm,
games where it almost seemed within their budget, they made sure that the musical composition was
mm,
almost as important as the gameplay. The Tekken franchises, Namco,
mm.
Namco's music composition department
Oh
was
yes.
playing no jokes. That whenever you were in a scene, you almost
I
didn't
agree.
want to finish the level because you're still listening to the song. It's like, no, no, let's run around a bit more. I really like this song. Sometimes the song would be
Mm,
such a slap. You'd even call a friend and say, "Hey, come listen to this song. Come, I'm at this level. How is this song? Listen." You almost couldn't believe what you were finding, and the sense of urgency you felt in a
Yeah.
boss fight, and it was really something that has
Mm,
left an impact on me today. Whereas for certain European games, some of the
mm,
highlights they had for me were some of the jump scares, and sometimes the level design in European games were very. There
mm,
was a sense of putting you in deep, deep puzzles that needed a gaming guide to explain how to get out. And I
mm,
suppose the European style of play at that
mm,
time was had heavy emphasis on the challenge aspect, or at least for me, that's kind of what it felt like. And then on the American
mm,
side of games, they
mm.
seem to really like their guns a lot, a lot. At least in my opinion,
Oh
that's what I
yeah,
felt.
oh yeah. That's actually true.
Firepower
Yeah.
and a certain sense of attitude. The American aesthetic was also very, very strong in American games that I played, particularly Twisted Metal, and
Mm.
it had a lot of influence from American fiction,
Uh,
post-apocalyptic worlds. Even the villains in American games were also very particular. You might have more clowns as villains,
mm.
or that sort of thing. But a big emphasis on
Mad Men
explosive
and all of that. Yeah.
explosions, dwoosh, and TNT. That's when I first
Mm,
encountered TNT and dynamite, and that was like a big theme in games at the time. Things exploding and bombs.
mm,
Um, in my opinion, having played some of those
mm,
different aesthetics, also the way they really portrayed
mm,
female protagonists at that time, a lot has changed now. But even
mm.
if Lara Croft was around
Oh
today,
yeah,
Lara
definitely,
Croft of
definitely.
then probably had an OnlyFans versus the Lara Croft of now, who looks more like Nathan Drake.
Oh.
So, like, the aesthetic was different. Whereas in Japan, everything, the female
Yeah.
protagonists and also female characters, NPCs, were also very, very kawaii. Cuteness got maxed out. You're like, okay, guys, these are some super,
Mm-hmm.
super cute
Mm-hmm.
characters that even afterwards you go to school and you'd still be discussing the characters. Like, did you see this other character that you encounter? And then at that time, you're young boys, you have no chance to interact with
Mm.
girls. So you only saw virtual girls through the PlayStation. And you'd be like, oh, you have to see this other
Yeah.
character in this game. And you're there with crushes on video game
Mm.
characters. And it was another world where you could travel
Yeah.
and do different things. And
Mm.
Final Fantasy, as you mentioned, SquareSoft, them having a world map in Japanese
Mm-hmm.
games, I felt a very, very massive sense of accomplishment and completing tasks and qualification. In Gran Turismo, that
Mm.
license mode, I felt like I was training and improving my driving.
Mm.
Each little thing I acquired were little
Mm.
tick boxes that
Mm.
to this day I still relate to. That feeling a big sense of accomplishment. Pokemon collecting badges. I felt Japanese games that was a very important aspect.
Mm.
Collecting things and trophies. Mm,
Mm. No, no. A lot of games were. Yeah, that's you broke it down
mm,
beautifully. I say, like, when coming back to what I was saying, when games brought different things to the table, or different regions, let me say,
mm,
like they all tried to push on that aspect, as you've mentioned, and also just memorable characters and everything in between. So it was always that case of, like what I mentioned was, because we have more power now, what can we bring to the table? And let's
mm,
do something interesting, because at least we have the budget for the games now. Let's
mm,
push and do something different, you know? As opposed to now, the spectrum has kind of changed in a sense, because look, it's very expensive to make games.
mm,
If you saw the budgets for some of the games out there for AAA titles, let me
mm,
say, and even just small indie titles as well, we're not talking small numbers here. I'll definitely say for certain. But that experimentation and, then yeah, I'll put it as experimentations, as a sole thing. You see it more with the indie developers, not so much the AAA titles, from at least what I can understand. Some do try and take risks and
mm,
do something different here and there,
mm,
but the thing is, I can kind of understand why they're not so risk taking, is
mm,
because at the end of the day, board members and accountants are going to decide what is ultimately going to come out of this, and also the publishers as well.
mm,
That's how it's going to come out. Whereas with the indie titles, I feel especially the ones that I've been playing lately on PC and also on the consoles as well, they're taking a lot more risks. And also, I see a lot more interesting things as opposed to AAA stuff. It's not to say that, hey, AAA stuff has bitten the dust. No, that's not the case. But I'm seeing more interesting things on that spectrum, I say. And it's harkening back to those days where in the PlayStation 1 and even PlayStation 2 onwards, that this is how people used to go and push the envelope, to put it like
Mm.
that.
Okay. So to steer back to the PlayStation 1 now, can you describe an interaction or an experience that you had with a PlayStation marketing campaign
Mm.
that really had left an impression on you or resonated with you? A particular marketing campaign. Please describe, tell us
Mm.
where you saw it, what it was, what about it you felt made it so appealing.
So this one stretches into the PlayStation 2 era,
But we're
which
at
and one
PlayStation
of the
1.
franchises
The
that's
main,
also
the
a bit
topic
near
of
and
today is
dear
the
to me.
PlayStation 1. PlayStation 1.
Mm. You see, the PlayStation 1 is a bit difficult to say because a few of the advertising campaigns, the memory is a bit spotty because I was
Oh,
quite
okay.
young at the time. And
Okay.
then moving forward, we started seeing things into the PlayStation 2. So,
Mm,
one that really sticks out to me was Ratchet and Clank, the very first Ratchet and Clank, and also
that was
Gran
on
Turismo 3 to an
PS2.
extent, but I'll
Okay.
stick to this one. Yeah, that was on PS2. So that was
Okay.
us transitioning more from the PlayStation 1 to the PlayStation 2 era, where we started seeing more of the things on TV. And remember, I'm getting a little bit older, so
Okay.
a lot of the things are starting to stick a little bit more.
Okay.
So for me, it was why I say Ratchet and Clank was I remember watching KTV one day. That was an old DSTV channel and real fun channel.
Hmm.
Internet open time. That used to be a
Okay.
thing
So it
in
was
South Africa.
kids
So
TV, like prime
yeah,
time for kids. We could you so it's like
yeah.
X-Men. This had our full attention. KTV. Okay.
Mm. Yeah, it had our full attention, definitely. And I saw the advert for Ratchet and Clank, the commercial, as the Americans will call it, that aired on this. And I was just like, it was an animation. That's what it
Okay.
was. And it showed different gameplay shots and just transitioning from gameplay footage of in-engine gameplay stuff into animation showing what you can do in the game, the kinds of gadgets and, explosives, guns and things that you can play with. It appealed more to preteens, I'd say, at the time. And of course, what the age rating was for that game was 7 years old, according to Peggy,
Okay.
which was the age rating system. Everyone knows Peggy at this point.
Okay.
And when I
Sorry,
saw
which was
that
the production
as a
house
young
that made
lad,
this game?
I was, yeah.
Sorry, which was the sorry to interrupt. Which was the
Oh, it was
production
the
house?
same.
Okay.
It was the same production house as Spyro the Dragon, which is Insomniac Games. So yeah, one of the staples.
Okay, and where are they from?
They're from America.
So it's American style gaming, firepower, action, boom. Okay.
Mm. Mm. And that stuck with me for a while
Mm,
until eventually we got a PlayStation 2 in the
mm,
household. And then on that demo disc that came with the PlayStation 2 was a demo for Ratchet and Clank. I lost count of the amount of time I've spent in that demo because of what that game presented. Not just, mindless shooty bang bang action, but actually something where you have to think about, okay, how am I going to approach this? Which gadget should I use? Which, firepower should I use against certain enemies? But then one of the other things that stuck with me also was this is quite a thing with Ratchet and
mm.
Clank is its message about consumerism and also the kinds of jokes that it also put into play as well. It made it such a memorable game in terms of how the characters also interacted with each other and even just cutscenes that used to display in the game and all of that. And that's what made that game so memorable for me. And one of those things where I was just like, this is PlayStation. Like, this is pushing the envelope.
Mm,
And more so for me than what Xbox brought to the table, because what a lot of people remember about Xbox is Halo, you
mm,
know? And for me, especially as a PlayStation kid and also Nintendo kid growing up as well, this is what stuck out to me the most. And also, this was also what was available to us at the time,
mm.
because a lot of the other consoles, like the GameCube, didn't really take off here, from what I understand. you do find a few consoles and things floating around, but it wasn't as big as the PlayStation 2 was. So it's also considering what it was like at the time, gaming and that environment, I'd say.
Okay. What are some of the things you've noticed? So, with this Ratchet and Clank, the main character, the protagonist, Ratchet, what similarities have you seen
Mm.
between Ratchet and Crash Bandicoot? They're both, okay, AAA titles. What similarities did you see between the two?
The fact that they're anthropomorphic animal
Yeah.
characters,
Okay.
and who doesn't love animals? That's the first thing. But then also at the
Animals.
same time, the design of the characters themselves. So of course it's going to appeal to children, but at the same time also they needed to be expressive. That was
Mm,
one of the big things. Because the human face, like even as I'm doing now, like I'm moving my eyebrows, I'm emoting on my face and
mm,
everything.
mm,
There's only so much that you can do with human expression. Even, let's say if we take it realistically in an artistic sense, there's only so much that you can do that you have to stick to anatomy and everything in between. Whereas with more, and this is another big thing also with pertaining to Ratchet and Clank as well as Crash Bandicoot, is that you could almost see them as cartoon characters. Let me put it like that. So of course you want them to emote. You want them to be appealing as opposed to children to approach. People come to the game, but it's also not to a point where it's so obnoxious that even adults wouldn't want to touch upon that.
mm,
So I think those are the two similarities from what I could see, especially in terms of design with what they could put forward, and also very different to a lot of the Japanese design characters that were out there as well.
mm,
Like if we look at Crash Bandicoot and Ratchet and Clank, in terms of Japanese platformers at the time, one that comes to mind is Klonoa as well. So Klonoa, like one thing I've seen at least about Japan also is they love cats.
mm,
That's one thing I've definitely seen,
mm, mm,
and Klonoa is one of those cat-like characters that you see, and of course, long ears, everything, and very cutesy. That's the other thing that I've seen, very cutesy characters.
mm.
But at the same time, with a lot more of the Western stuff, it's like you're appealing to young boys and also young girls as well who are interested in that at the into that sphere of gaming,
Mm.
and they were cool characters. You wanted to, let's say, if you're a kid, you wanted to hang out with them. You
Yeah.
wanted to, of course, show your mates and be like, "Hey, I'm playing this character. Like, yo, I got this game." Like even Jack and Daxter as well, similar to that. So that's what people, I'd say kids, particularly at the time, that's what we
Okay.
also just got into at that point.
Mm.
So yeah.
Okay. Okay. Um, so we've identified art. We've identified the origins
Mm,
of the different production houses. In your personal experience,
mm.
which and in what style did the storytelling that this console did, how did that appeal to you or resonate with you? And how was the particular style or a style of storytelling that really spoke to you? Was it maybe through a sense of completing tasks or things that happened to certain characters or any way
Uh,
stories can be told? Because in my experience, that machine was able to tell stories in a multitude of ways, not just one way of storytelling.
mm, mm. I think when we deal with storytelling, I think one of the things that makes, I'd say, I'll use Final Fantasy VII as an example, would be the fact that you have a protagonist, we see he's been through some stuff, and seeing how that protagonist pioneers through a situation, dealing with grief, happiness, and everything in between, that's us as humans would relate with as well. And seeing all those things, especially in something like what people would basically regard as, oh, video games is just mindless fun and all of that, to see that you could do that in such a medium, I think made it so memorable for a lot of people, and even myself included as well, because it's like, you know, it's not just a case of you're watching someone on TV acting something out. It's a completely different experience, I'd say. You're literally controlling these characters. You're in taking part within their decisions. And I think that's the big thing also. It's taking part in what's happening and pioneering with said protagonists, said characters and everything in between. So, to a point where you become attached to such characters in a sense.
Mm.
Kind of like how you would react when you're reading a storybook or watching a movie in particular. So being able to express what you saw on your TV and your storybooks, but being able to interact with a little controller and just being like, so this is what it's like to feel this in a sense. It's a different experience.
I can definitely relate to what you've described with how, especially through that console, you felt life, you felt death, you felt competition, you felt thrills,
Mm,
you felt true fear. Uh, I've One of the most
mm.
terrifying moments I had was playing Resident Evil 2. I'd borrowed it from a friend and I played
Oh
5 minutes
no.
of it. I saw my first
Oh
zombie
no.
and I turned it off. I said, "No, I can't do this." And now that I look back, and they had those CGI short movies, and this is going to lead into the next question I'd like to ask you. But what they were able to do with those CGI movies, considering at the time it was avant garde, the console was so powerful, 32-bit graphics,
Mm,
that was incredible. But now that I look back, those CGI
yeah.
events were quite short, but the amount of storytelling and amount of
Mm,
information they could convey. Oh, look, a scary zombie is coming towards
mm,
me. Oh, wow. Even though there wasn't full
mm,
on voice acting, and I'd be like, even when the voice
mm.
recordings of that, it was just enough to say, okay, cool,
Oh,
I'm terrified.
yeah.
Didn't Even it didn't need the type of Dolby surround that you can now get with modern day consoles, but the effect, it was so
Mm,
highly effective what they were able to do. I was shocked, and they
mm,
made the character slow and human, and you felt that sense of, oh
mm.
no, am I physically capable to get through this task? I don't know. You felt that stress. You had your
Yeah.
item, you had limited ammo, you had to aim.
Mm,
Oh, I hope this shot works.
yeah.
You sometimes when you're playing
And
the
it's,
game,
it's
your
even it's
heart was
even the thing
literally
of
beating.
yeah.
Like, um, but leading
Mm,
up to my next point that I'd like to ask you is, so
mm,
at that time,
mm,
the console had its limitations. It was CD-ROM, which was avant-garde, but there was only so much you could do.
mm.
However, they were able still to do so
Yeah.
much with so little. And nowadays, with bigger consoles and more storage, a more powerful
Mm,
device, but I don't know, but the games don't feel as fun. Have you felt something similar? And do
mm.
you have an understanding of why it feels like that?
I think it's just where gaming is going,
Mm,
and what I've picked up at least with a lot of AAA titles, what I've seen, there's a lot of emphasis on how many, well, not how many, how much can we push this console graphically?
mm,
How realistic can we be? Let's add in these effects and everything in between. But I think one of the big things I've picked up is how cinematic can we make this?
mm.
You know, so how can we make this like a Disney Pixar movie? How can we make this like, let's say, Troy or something along those lines?
The time of the PlayStation 1, they were able to use so little to do so much in a very effective way. Modern day now, with 4K gaming, internet gaming, more graphical power, Dolby
Mm,
Super Surround, motion capture, camera, all of that.
mm,
How come for
mm.
some games aren't as fun as then? Why are we feeling this diminishing returns with modern gaming, that we aren't able
Mm.
to get as much of a thrilling experience with the storytelling, with the thrills, the emotions? Why is that?
I think it depends who you are. That's one thing. The second thing, and at least the way that I see it, is coming back to what I said earlier, in that, look, it costs a lot of money to make games. It is not cheap at all. And at the end of the day, you're contending with publishers who have very strict deadlines, and contending with people in a boardroom, and ultimately the accountants. So when you're contending with all of that, you kind of almost have to make something almost formulaic in a sense. And also, what are the trends at the current time as well? So from what I see right now is there's a lot of emphasis on the battle royale, your Fortnites of the world and everything in between, because people have seen that, okay, we'll do the next popular thing that makes money. That's, I think, what it's come down to. Because at the end of the day, gaming is a business. That's the truth of it, unfortunately. And as a business, you need to make money, you need to have returns, you need profits, and people need salaries to put food on the table. So that's, I feel, one of the big things that has come about. And as a result of that, people, at least in the AAA sphere, people aren't exactly that willing to take risks, because if the game flops, it's like, who's going to pay the money back from that? So that's when it becomes quite, I'd say, sad, but at the same time also to understand that, if a company is, or publish, or not publisher, a developer is going to take a risk in particular, it needs to be very good and it needs to be very substantiated, especially to the accountants and higher ups, to say that, all right, we'll give you the go ahead. This is going to be your budget. Work with it. So it's also good in a sense that within those limitations, you breed that creativity, which is good. But at the same time, like what I mentioned, that this is where indie titles come in, because there's people who want to make interesting games or tell their story, or express their art in particular ways, where, okay, you're not going to get the prettiest thing where you can see someone's pores on their skin, and you're not going to get Troy Baker doing the voice acting for it, but you're going to get something where you can see this passion that's put into it. Like one of the games actually that I played today, in fact, a demo from the Tribeca Games Film Festival, is Signalis. So what Signalis basically is, it's a cosmic horror survival horror game, and it's made by two people. Think about that for a second. It's made by two people, and there's a level of aesthetic and just effort, work, and smoothness, passion that is put into that game that you think a team made this, like a big team made this. But then when you actually look into the story of it, it just leaves you a bit surprised and also like amazed at what has been achieved over here. And I can say that for a lot of indie titles as well, because I played a few AAA games not too long ago as well, and I was like, these are cool. I see what people like them and all that. But at the same time, I felt more of a fun and different experience from indie games. To name a few would be Necro Barrister. That's also a fun game as well.
Please,
About
please, can you describe it as
it's
someone
more
who's
it's more
never seen
story
it?
orientated, I'd say.
Mm. Please, really go into it.
Yeah,
What
so
is
Necro
what?
Barrister is more of a story orientated. Oh, I think there was a bit of a delay there, but yeah, there we go.
Mm.
So Necro Barrister is basically a story, story. I'd say more of a story game rather than so much gameplay, which tells the story of a cafe in the, I don't want to say underworld, but I'd say in between, in Australia. And what basically happens in this cafe is, let's say you croaked, for lack of a better term, and you're on your way to your eternal resting place. And in between, you stop by this cafe, come to conclusion of what has happened, and you realize that, oh wait, I'm going to the place now. You have your coffee, and there you go, you're on your way. Similar to what you'd experience in real life, in the sense of you're going to work in the morning, you stop by a cafe, you see your favorite barrister, you have a chat, you have your coffee, boom, boom, you're on your way to work, and you go through the rest of your day. But they deal with it in such a way that, from what I've played so far, and I don't want to put in so many spoilers, that it makes for an interesting experience, and it tells a particular story with interesting Aussie humor I've seen, and just overall fun to it. And with indie titles like that, that makes it also all the more memorable for me as well. There's even another one as well called Valhalla, which is cyberpunk bartender action. It is what you think it is. It's basically that. Interesting music, it tells an interesting story, and memorable characters as well. And also to see that, the developers had free reign in this. They spent their time on it, they poured their passion into it. And it's not all about budget. That's the thing. You need, of course, money to make a game at the end of the day. But you can see that with what they had and what they did, this is cool, this is interesting, and that's why even it's a hell of a lot cheaper as well to get into if you have a computer and all that. And just interesting to check out. Even another game that I really liked that was in the same vein as Ridge Racer, in fact, Inertial Drift, which is made by an Irish developer, interestingly enough. And the way they nails the aesthetic, music, and even story mode on top of that, which is something you don't really see very much of in racing games. Apart from the Need for Speeds that you get around now, and everything in between, and that it's just mimicking what was there in those PlayStation 1 days, and even just retro days as well. And people put their own spin on it and put their own, I'd say, how can I put this? Their own love. Let me put it like that. And I feel that's where indie titles come to be a bit more interesting, in my opinion, because they have more of that free reign in a sense. And I feel that's where also they need a lot of support as well. If you see a title that you like or you find that's interesting, and it's also a good way to expand your horizons as well, gaming wise, and different media, different experiences, I'd say definitely check them out. There's a lot of them on Steam, a lot of them on the PlayStation Network, Nintendo Store, Xbox Live, depending on what console you have, what you prefer to game with. And they kind of also have that retro gaming experience personified in a sense, because a lot of people experience all those games on PS1, Nintendo Entertainment System, and all of that, or even PC gaming to an extent as well. And they're basically putting, like, I don't want to say like making their own type, but basically putting out their own expression. And I feel that's very interesting to see.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, I think we've gone on for about an hour and we've really gone in detail and elaborated on why you are refurbishing a PlayStation 1. It is an aesthetic, it is a sound, it is a feeling, it is an experience, it is a world, it is a basket of variety, it is a point in time. Uh,
Mm,
that's what the PlayStation 1 is
mm,
and why you've gone back to it. So I want to say thanks so much for joining me for this episode. I'm going to give it a
mm.
good edit. And
Well, thank you
is
for
there
having
anything
me.
else you'd like to add?
Ultimately, have fun with games. It's a different medium, and it's not just mindless fun. Some of the time it is. You kind of need that, especially with the times that we're going through now, and just to escape to a different reality. And don't get soaked up too much into it, but have fun with it mostly. And yeah, that's how I would put it as exactly. And explore different forms of media. Regardless of what some people may say, even if it's anime or anything in between. And yeah, that's what I would say.
Excellent, excellent. And I just so happen to have an Instagram profile open now. I'm just going to share it on
Mhm,
screen of someone who's quite passionate about gaming and automotives. And there's a particular picture I wanted to show
mhm,
of your original copy of Ridge
mm,
Racer Type 4. And I wanted to keep this content
mhm. That's the
mostly
one.
descriptive and chatting, but it's always nice every so often to show a visual of the aesthetic, having the package in your hand and the booklet.
Mm,
And this was a time before games were
mm.
downloaded off of the internet, and you had to protect this
Yeah.
disc with your life.
Well before.
And when the disc got scratched, then your gaming
Mm.
experience sort of ended. You might not make it past the loading screen, and that's where your
That's
dream,
it.
your world ended.
That was it.
And these covers were so
No,
fragile,
it's
would crack, and then
yeah.
you,
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah. That one is actually cracked. Interestingly enough,
Mm,
but everything else is still pretty intact.
mm.
But yeah, that's one of the things with retro gaming, where finding a decent copy and also keeping your old copies can tend to be a bit of a task, especially when you're moving a lot. That's one thing I'll say for
No
certain. But
backups.
also the other thing is, coming back to the whole thing about downloaded media and all of that now, because look, distribution is expensive. I can understand, and also at the same time, especially the times that we're going through right now, and also indie developers and what they can also sort out. Um, yeah, it's nice to have the game in your hand. You open it, you go to the store, you buy it, or as Take a Lot will deliver these days. It depends on who you are, and opening it, experiencing it, seeing the manuals and just the disc artwork, everything. Even you get not quotation, sorry, quotes on the back of the box to say, from different publishing companies to say that this was an amazing game, 9 out of 10, everything in between. You need to try this now. If you don't, you're a chump, everything in between. And something you don't get much of these days. Like, I bought a PlayStation 4 game the other day, and thank you very much for having me. Thank you. Cover art looks nice. Disc also looks nice. It's supposed to be a booklet in here, but well, there's inserts for a booklet, but there's no booklet to begin with. And it's one of the things that I miss in particular. But at the same time, also, I was like, it's of a time. Things are changing. What can you do? Also, if you do want to get into retro gaming as well, there's plenty stores that do stock the old games and also old hardware as well on top of that. To name a few would be Nexus Hub in Randburg, Nexus Hub Retail, and also Twisted Realms, Alberton. Twisted Realms is a beautiful store. I found a lot of good stuff there and really passionate owners. It's always good having a chat with them. And, it's stores like that that I really love. And it's something that also adds to the memorable, well, making it more memorable as well. My English is leaving me. So, yeah, there we go.
I couldn't agree more. It was such an interesting time, even with the marketing. Remember when they'd show you a CGI clip, which was made by another studio, which had nothing to do with the gameplay of the actual game, and marketing was so different then. Nowadays, I watch a playthrough on YouTube before I even decide picking up a game, and it's all external commentary and testimonials.
Yeah.
Whereas before, the screenshots were just made by another studio. It wasn't even of the game. You never really knew what you were getting. But it was a wild time. But that said,
Not
I
even
think
just
we'll.
that, but also just the internet. Yeah, the internet
It was
just
a different
changed
time,
everything
eh?
as well, and how people also behave on the internet, just like treading different waters. So yeah, that's what it is.
It was a different time. Anyway, thanks so much. This was Tayeeds. Please follow me on Instagram. Am I streaming or am I dreaming? More wild conversations, in depth, in detail. If you would like to be on this show, please comment below. I'll see if I like you or not, and maybe you too could be on Am I Streaming or Am I Dreaming? Signing out.
Ah,